Hello there! In the Farscape universe, in a distant part of the galaxy, the race we know as the Sebaceans, or sometimes generally referred to as Peacekeepers, with the two names being pretty much interchangeable, were one of the dominant powers, but their empire had its weaknesses, it had its problems. Most of them were easily overcome. One of them was something they wanted to overcome. They wanted to integrate a certain type of technology into their ships. As discussed before, in order to achieve FTL, their vessels had to spool up and accelerate to superluminal velocities and then decelerate when they wanted to stop. But there was a classification of alien ship capable of instantaneous FTL travel, and these were the Leviathans. Now, Leviathans were a genetically engineered type of starship. Basically, they were organic technology. They were sentient, but they, similar to sort of a horse, liked having people on board them. They also, in order to properly navigate the galaxy and increase their chances of survival and procreation, they needed pilots, which were a general name for a species that were inserted within them, who allowed them to more adequately navigate the galaxy, activate their starburst properly, interact with other races and ships in a rational manner. Leviathans had poor communication skills, but although they did need this help, they could work autonomously without it. They just kind of craved it. And they were designed to carry a crew. No two Leviathans were exactly the same, a bit like no two people. In terms of basic size and shape and capabilities, they were all the same. But they would have slightly different internal layouts. They were kind of adapted for how the crew wanted them to be and how they'd organically grown into their form. So they'd have different numbers of crew quarters. There was no exact layout for what they should look like. So you couldn't exactly have a general schematic for the ship and it be interchangeable. However, the starburst ability was very useful, but controlling Leviathans was hard because without a pilot, other species couldn't interact with them. They couldn't control them. Pilots could, sort of. It was more like a symbiotic relationship rather than a pilot necessarily telling the ship what to do. The Leviathan could push back and refuse. It wouldn't necessarily do it, and there were ways around that. You could lobotomize them, things like that, but besides the point. You also, as the Peacekeepers discovered, could use control collars. These prevented them from doing starbursts and kept them in place while you experimented on them. The real goal of the Peacekeepers was to create a Leviathan Peacekeeper hybrid. They wanted the Leviathans as a weapons platform, but Leviathans were unarmed, purely defensive ships, and their only real defense was their ability to starburst. They did have a few other sort of tricks, but generally speaking they didn't carry guns or weapons. They couldn't really be outfitted with them either because their technology was incompatible. Because they were biological, you couldn't just slap guns onto them. You could strap guns onto them, but getting them controllable by the ship itself, no. And the vessel would reject them, and the pilots wouldn't use them. There was all kinds of issues. The goal would be to create a new breed, as these were genetically engineered, a new breed of Leviathan, which would just naturally have these things. Several attempts were made, all of which failed, sometimes killing the Leviathan. Now I noted that Leviathans organically reproduce, just like an animal. They give birth to young. That young then grows into a new ship and repeats the cycle. They're a species, in a sense, that was bioengineered as a space-dwelling life form to carry occupants around. An incredible feat of engineering, far beyond anything the Peacekeepers, the Scarans, the Luxons, or any of the other races can do. But with study, patience, and time, the Peacekeepers did accomplish something that no one thought they could. A pregnant Leviathan called Moya, its offspring was genetically modified. Another one of the myriad of attempts that they had made to create one of these hybrids. But this one worked. The baby, a boy, a male Leviathan, was slowly growing inside the mother. As it reached its time to be born, it was quite obvious that there was something off. It didn't look quite right. It was a slightly different shape. Its hull was a little stronger and it was more aggressive. As a result, Moya was not capable of birthing it because of its inherent deformities. It tried to escape by blasting its way out of its own mother's womb because it had weapons. Peacekeeper engineered weapons. Once freed, the ship would act much like any other Leviathan. Eventually it would need a pilot to help it navigate and operate, and it was a baby. It would slowly grow. into a full-grown ship, and its abilities would manifest. See, things like starburst, stuff like that, the little ones can't do it. They rely on the mother. They rely on the mother for pretty much everything, just like any newborn. And they grow, and their internal layout and structure and design and what they're going to be kind of grows with them as they grow up, including doing things like growing shuttlecrafts and making more DRDs, things of that nature. This ship obviously had some inherent differences. Its hull was heavily armoured for a start. It was a more aggressively designed ship. It became known as Talyn. It was also compatible with Sebacean physiology, something that no other Leviathan was. He could have a pilot that wasn't a pilot, or a member of the pilot race. He could have a Peacekeeper. The Peacekeeper that would ultimately take command, although this wasn't the original plan, was Bylar Crace. Crace had been the antagonist of the crew of Moya for much of the time that they'd spent on the run. But now him, a disgraced officer amongst the Peacekeepers, had gone on the run himself. He would eventually make something of a redemption of himself, and his communion and symbiotic relationship with Talyn would be beneficial to both of them. It would temper Talyn's aggression, but it would also teach Crace to be a better man, and more forgiving, and less mad. Ultimately, it was beneficial. But Talyn had some pretty spectacular abilities. I mentioned that he was born fully armed and weaponized, basically like a shark, ready to bite, ready to feed immediately. But as he grew, more weapons would manifest, his hull would get stronger. He would get, as I said, stronger armor, but more additional weapons would become self-evident. It was obvious that there were weapons emplacements, sort of parts of him that were going to grow into weapons but weren't yet weapons. But as he grew a little, some of them did become active before his unfortunate demise. The weapons array which he had at the point of his maximum size included one aft torpedo tube, 2 small pulse cannons, as well as 1 primary sonic ascendancy cannon. He also had additional internal weapons emplacements, and even his DRDs were armed. Basically, he was a beast. By this point, he'd also grown at least 1 shuttle. He was an impressive ship, capable of outmaneuvering and outrunning and outgunning pretty much anything. This is why the Peacekeepers wanted these things. They wanted a fleet of them. Once one was created, you could use it to breed more. Now, the original creators of the Leviathans, because Moya was able to breed a warship, did attempt to destroy her as a result of this, as a punishment, because if Moya could breed warships, that meant Moya could breed more. But Talyn was eventually destroyed, sacrificing himself, but he led an honourable life. Yes, he was created for war, a war that he would never fight, thankfully, because it was a war that was never for him, it was never for his kind. It was always for the Peacekeepers. Luckily, he was kept out of Peacekeeper control and was never used against their enemies, or against other Leviathans to breed more like him. However, an honourable and powerful little ship, with a distinct coloration as well, being black and red in coloration instead of this typical Leviathan brown, and generally a more aggressive, violent look to him. He was capable of starbursting just like his mother, and unusually for such a young Leviathan was able to do it at a younger age. Again, probably a result of the genetic engineering. We'll never know the ship's full true potential, or just how heavily armed he would have been if he'd been allowed to grow to full maturity. That is also the end of this episode. Thank you for watching. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, I thank you, and please like, share and subscribe, and hit the bell notification icon if you want to see more videos like this. This channel is mostly Star Trek, but I like to touch on a few other science fiction franchises from time to time, including Farscape, which is one I've not really touched much, but I do love and have great fond memories of it. If this is your first introduction to Farscape, because I know that although looking at the demographics that actually watch my videos, they are mostly in the age group where you would have been teenagers when this was on, just like me, so basically my own age. But there are also a growing demographic of people much younger. If you're not familiar with this series, I highly recommend giving it a chance. It had a fantastic cast, it was well written, it was extremely good in production value with the puppetry and lighting and the general direction of the show. The CGI, it was made in the late 90s. You've got to look at it. It was made in the late 90s as it was made in the late 90s. Of course, it doesn't hold up, but a lot of it kind of does. A lot of it's still strong. It's not bad, unenjoyable, and wherever possible they did use, miniatures and puppets, so it does look good, and it does, more importantly, entertain, and it doesn't shy away from dark themes. It doesn't hide from taboo stories. It doesn't shy away from showing both the light and the dark in people. And I do recommend you giving it a shot if you've never seen it. But again, that is the end of this video. After my additional last little bit of a ramble for an extra minute after the previous last bit of this video. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now, and in the description box below there are links to my other social media accounts.